Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Natasha Hodgson from Nottingham Trent University. I'm really excited to talk to you today about women and the Crusades. It has been a kind of passion for me over many years working on this topic. I had a great comment already there in the chat from Tessa I saw about, I've joined to hear more about women who've often been overlooked, ignored in history books. Well, today, I hope to remedy some of that, especially in the context of the Crusades. I mean, I guess I started down this route really as an undergraduate and, taking a Crusades module and, looking into some fantastic figures that really hadn't been given much attention, I think, in many of the textbooks up to that point. And so that's got set me down the path of doing a master's and then a PhD. And still, I think, although academic research in the Crusades is beginning to really flag up some key figures and important women who were involved in crusading, there are still perhaps some barriers in terms of getting them into the textbooks and getting them to be taught at schools. So that's part of the reason why I'm presenting to you today. And my basic argument will be that I think that what we need to do is kind of maximise the view that we currently have of women and try and take every opportunity to explore some of the different case studies attached to crusading so that we can really kind of cast the net as wide as we possibly can. And there are some real benefits, I think, for doing that. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Crusades have a huge impact on the lives of women across Europe, in Byzantium, in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. And perhaps, in part, the Crusades have been, seen as quite traditional and have this quite top-down elite perspective that needs to be blown apart a bit. And I think partly as well, when it comes to the Crusades, there's been a bit too much focus on motivation rather than impact. And again, that stops us thinking about perhaps, how many people were involved in crusading activity. So I think that today I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview of some of the topics that I want to cover. I'll just move on to, oh, slides don't appear to be moving forward. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. So the first question I'm going to think about is, why do the Crusades seem to be inherently masculine? It may seem obvious, but it's worth kind of thinking about how our perception of the Crusades now influences the way we approach the history of it. Then I'm going to talk a bit about defining female Crusaders. I titled this course, this talk, Crucesignatae, which basically means it's a female word for Crusader signed with the cross. But it's very rarely used. So, we need to think about broadening our definition of female Crusaders. We can think about how and why women are involved, and also how actually doing this can benefit Crusader studies more broadly. So, why are the Crusades seen as inherently masculine? Now, obviously, when most people think about the Crusades, they'll imagine a knight on horseback, maybe a male sort of Christian warrior, perhaps with in a suit of armour, sporting a cross. And we'll have this kind of real sort of, this is an image that's reinforced by later romances, by the resurgence of interest in crusading as a theme in the art and literature of the 19th century, but it still has a very strong kind of cachet today. And we see it a lot in popular books, films, TV, and gaming, even recent political events. I think, I've got a meme here that I picked up on, that there are some, there's loads of Crusader memes out there, but this one in particular is very kind of, talking about girls posting about One Direction while guys are interested in these military events of the Crusades. Of course, this happened the other week, which again kind of gets us to think about, what do people think Crusaders are, and what does the word crusade mean now? How is it that England fans going to Qatar think it's okay to turn up in Crusader costumes? And so there's a big disconnect between, what happens in the medieval Crusades and what people think about Crusaders now. And they do tend to think about it just in terms of knights, in terms of adventure, in terms of good guys and bad guys, a very kind of, I guess, this world view, which is very kind of far removed from what medieval crusading may actually have involved. And they do lend themselves to quite a sort of what we would call a hyper-masculine culture. However, there are kind of comparable female cultural references for crusading, and I've kind of added a few here. Now, if we go sort of right back to sort of late medieval times, there's Joan of Arc, of course. Now, she's seen to be this kind of archetypal female warrior figure. And although she's not directly involved in a crusade per se, she does have religious authority through the voices that she hears. She's fighting this kind of national war in France on behalf of the Dauphin. And it's God who tells her to fight. So there's parallels there. But interestingly as well, Joan herself said that she was fighting in order to establish the French king, so that he could then lead a crusade to the Holy Land. So ultimately, that was one of her goals. And we have kind of female involvement connected to the crusade, right through the sort of 16th, 17th centuries. On the right there, we've got Catherine Jeanne Gaussin, who had played the lead in a play by Voltaire about the Crusades, or that was set at the time of the Crusades in Zaire. This is the main character, who is essentially captured and taken as a slave when Caesarea is captured. But again, it sort of shows that there is this role for a female lead, and it kind of feeds into this very romanticized and orientalized version of Crusade history, European version of crusading history. In the 19th century, down here, we've got William Bell Scott's return from the Crusade. Now, again, there's this resurgence of interest in crusading in the 19th century, and there's a lot of art where the women are remaining at home while the men go off on crusade. And here, the returning crusader, the children kind of barely recognize them, and she looks a little bit apprehensive about his return. Similarly, we also have crusade used in female context for the suffragists who had their crusade for votes. So again, a kind of secularized use of the term, but used in female context. And finally, my favourite is the My Little Pony, friendship is magic. So those of you who came to a training day recently will have probably seen this one before, but if you've not come across these guys, these are the Cutie Mark Crusaders: Sweetie Belle, Apple Bloom, and I can't forget, Scootaloo is the name of the other one. And I only came across them because my daughter likes them. But yeah, so there's this kind of modern secularization of the term crusade in the West. It seems to be used in very different contexts and very sort of sanitized contexts in comparison to its medieval ones. So then how do we define female crusaders? This is one of the big problems. If we were to stick with this term Crucesignatae, only a very few women in documents are described as this, signed with the cross. But this is not the only word for crusader, and indeed there isn't actually a word for crusade until the 13th century. Most often, crusaders are referred to as pilgrims, or sometimes they're described as undertaking the great journey and iter. So in the Latin, they don't always use this term, signed with the cross, anyway, to describe someone who's going on crusade. Most often they'll be just called a pilgrim. I mean, certainly we know that Crusaders, the difference between crusade and pilgrimage is that Crusaders are armed pilgrims. So they're carrying weapons with a view to fighting in the Holy Land. And because there's that military aspect to the crusading pilgrimage, that means that women are perhaps not expected to be involved, because theoretically they're excluded from the battlefield because of this fragilitas sexus, the fragility of their sex. However, in practice, when we look at kind of medieval women's history, they're still very much involved in all sorts of different military arenas. You know, they're involved in supplying armies, they're involved in supporting armies, they're involved in they're impacted by the arrival of armies. Some of them end up as camp followers. There's all sorts of different ways in which women's lives are affected by warfare in the medieval period. And just because they're not on the battlefield as trained warriors, that doesn't mean that they're not involved. So, you know, I think we need to take a pretty broad view when it comes to women and crusading, and we need to think about, you know, all of the different ways that women could possibly be involved in this in order to recover that part of the history. Now, women as Christians were entitled to go on penitential pilgrimages. So for the sake of their sins, they could go to various different places, or if they were going for healing, or all the many other reasons that people decided to go on pilgrimage during the medieval period. And we know that they went because the sources keep on telling us that they did. There was an important German study by Sabine Geldsetzer, which set out 91 named women going on crusade between 1095 and 1291, with a further 65 possibles. Now, possibles are, in her view, were those who, you know, say some of them had made a statement of intent that they were going to go, but we don't necessarily know whether they did go or not. So there's all of those to consider as well. And that's just for the period in which crusading to the Holy Land was at its height. Of course, crusading continues after that, and we have women involved in crusading in the Hussite region against the Hussites. We have women involved in all sorts of different crusading arenas. So it's really important to remember that it's not just crusading to the Holy Land. So bearing those things in mind, we can have a bit of a further think as well about pilgrimage and why women might have been involved in crusading. If the crusade is a pilgrimage, then why might women be involved in that? Well, I mean, we have a long history of Christian pilgrimage from the times of the early church. The main centres for pilgrimage activity are Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela. But of course, there's a cult in saints that really kind of grows in this high Middle Ages period, where there's lots of relics being circulated around Europe and lots of veneration of different saints. And certainly the Crusades themselves feed into that process of bringing relics back from the Holy Land. And all of this, you know, feeds into a genuine desire for people to go and visit these holy objects. In addition to that, pilgrimage has these penitential aspects. So going on crusade as a penance for sins, or going on pilgrimage for a penance for sins, is something that people take very seriously. We also have the fact that there are some concerns about women travelling in the medieval period. So occasionally we do have, say, ecclesiastical writers saying we don't think it's a good idea for women to travel. They're vulnerable. If they do, they might fall into sin. And certainly when it came to monastic women, they were quite worried about nuns deciding to travel outside the confines of the convent. However, that doesn't necessarily stop them from doing it. And one of the earliest female pilgrims is a Spanish abbess, Etheria, who writes about her travels. And also the image here is of Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine, who's possibly, the first pilgrim. So there's a strong female tradition of travel to visit the holy places. Given all of these things, it seems likely then that some women who already had ambitions to go on pilgrimage were attracted by the idea of crusade. We know that pilgrimages had been becoming more difficult. There had been, with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks, some attacks on pilgrim groups as they travelled through the area trying to reach Jerusalem. And so if you were a woman, perhaps you would be more attracted by the prospect of being able to travel with a large armed force to the Holy Land. We also need to bear in mind what the official church views were from the outset of crusading. Obviously, we have this issue where the Pope, we don't have the original call for the First Crusade. We have some speeches by Pope Urban II that were written by people who were present, but it's not necessarily verbatim what he said. And in fact, a lot of them have kind of, I suppose, embellished their accounts of his speech with their own kind of flavour or their take on it. And there's only one where he specifically mentions women's involvement in crusading activity. So out of the 5 eyewitness accounts that we have, it's only Robert of Reims who mentions women. And he said that Urban said, "We do not order or urge old men or the infirm or those least suited to arms to undertake this journey. Nor should women go at all without their husbands or brothers or official permission, for such are more of a hindrance than a help, a burden rather than a benefit." Now, I think this quote is quite an ambiguous one in some respects. It's not just saying women aren't allowed, it's saying they shouldn't go unless they've got protection, husbands, brothers, and official permission. So they need to ask someone to go. Also, they grouped within that are all the other non-combatants, old men, the infirm, those least suited to arms. So it's not just women who are being excluded. They're trying to ensure that they have a good military fighting force, but they're not laying down the law, and they recognise that in some circumstances there may be female involvement. Also, we have the letter of the Patriarch of Jerusalem to the West in 1098. Here he's requesting that they leave the women at home for now. But interestingly, as yet, he's recognizing that in order for people to stay and fight, then they need to settle. And if they're going to settle, they may want to bring their families as well. So families are a really crucial point when we think about crusading. Very many of the crusading armies that were put together involved networks of nobles who are related in one way or another, either by marriage or as cousins or fathers and sons sometimes. Here we have Ida of Boulogne on the right saying goodbye to her 3 crusading sons, Godfrey, Eustace and Baldwin. Of course, Godfrey becomes the first king of Jerusalem and Baldwin follows him not so long after. Eustace almost gets the crown, but then gets gazumped at the last minute by Baldwin II. But that's another story. But these are seen to be, these 3 brothers heading off together as part of the First Crusade, as seen to be, this kind of strong family connection. However, if somebody was married and they were going on crusade, they would expect to be away for a good long time, about 2 years at least, 2 to 3 years. So in the meantime, there were concerns that people might fall into adultery, that they might be tempted into sin or a lack of continence because they had they were apart from their partner. So this is why they needed to ask permission from their wives in order to take the cross, because the wife had to agree to this separation. So theoretically, the marriage vow then had precedence over the crusade vow, and this persisted at least until the 13th century, when Innocent III removed that barrier. The other thing was that the church was worried that people wouldn't go on crusade because they were worried about what would happen to their families in their absence and their family members. So they had to offer special protections in order to make sure that they could go. Guibert of Nogent mentions that in his account of Urban II's speech. He said he cursed with horrible anathema all those who might dare to harm the wives, sons, and possessions of those who took up God's journey for the next 3 years. So basically, the church offers to protect those who remain behind in an effort, perhaps, to try and ensure that they don't have too many non-combatants on crusade. And we do also see in some crusade charters that arrangements are being made for women who are being left behind, whether they're being cared for in a convent or whether they are taking on regency roles and actually, performing administrative roles on behalf of the crusader who's leaving. They've got to think about who's going to look after the property. Are the women who are there experienced enough to be regents? Very many of them are, because they're used to their partners going away and fighting. Then we need to think about what happens when crusaders die. A woman might be running the property in her husband's absence, but if he dies on crusade, she may not know for a very long time, or she may not find out at all. What if he's taken a slave? And then we have, big legal battles about proving, well, can you prove he's dead? Who's going to inherit? So there's all these kinds of issues. And, canon lawyers had a field day trying to decide how long it should take before a crusader's wife remarried. Some were saying 5, another was saying 100 years before she can, remarry. So there are all these legal issues, and this is all different ways in which crusading can impact on a woman's life, even if she doesn't take the cross. And it's definitely something that we could, build more on, because there are some very high-profile examples of these, actually. Another kind of reason, perhaps, for the authorities being concerned about women's presence on crusade revolved directly around the purpose of the crusading expedition, which would be, fighting on behalf of God, and concern that sin in any shape or form by crusaders might lead to God's displeasure and therefore military defeat. So there was a lot of concern about crusader sexuality and sexual activity. There was a lot of worry about prostitution happening on crusade, which undoubtedly it did, but it only seems to come up around the time of a big military defeat. It's like, why did we lose? It was because we were all being far too sinful. Or why are we having a really hard time here at the Siege of Antioch? It's because we've been too sinful, and therefore we need to get rid of all the women, which according to some sources they did, and get rid of prostitution from the camp and punish prostitution when it was found out in the camps. And then hopefully God's favour would return, and this would enable them to be successful. So there were concerns about that. Having said that, if women did travel out on crusades, their partners, there are very high death rates on crusade. Something like 1 in 3 of the named people that we know on say the first crusade. So very many of them may have ended up without partners or protection that they had originally set out with, and it might have been the case that new relationships sprang up, but there was a degree of social fluidity that meant that people weren't necessarily getting married, or in the more traditional way that they would have done. This would lead to then, worries about sin would lead to sort of processions and penitential practices at major points during a crusading expedition. I put here just an image of it's a later image of the Children's Crusade in 1212. And this is a really interesting one because it comes about around the time they're preaching the Albigensian Crusades in southern France. And it seems to spring up kind of both in France and Germany at the same time. And it's a movement of young people, not necessarily children per se, but people of lower social status who are convinced that if they march to Jerusalem, God will hand it back to them. And lots of stories have sprung up about this, but the chroniclers make a big point of saying, oh, and there were lots of women amongst them as well, and this is why they came to a bad end. So, although named women again are incredibly rare in this movement. So this association with sin. One high-profile figure, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who I'm sure those of you who teach the Crusades will have come across. She perhaps particularly gets a bad rep for maybe entering into an illicit relationship with her uncle Raymond of Poitou on the Second Crusade, and certainly, does her reputation kind of overshadow some of the other women who take part in the Crusades? Perhaps, but she's really like one of the only named examples in these texts. And the other worry, of course, is that they're generally kind of using up resources. However, we also see a lot of these women performing auxiliary roles. So I'll go on to discuss that in a minute. So thinking about how we can maximise the view, then we can talk about female participants, and I will cover a couple of those, but we can also think about women impacted by the Crusades. We can think about the violence that they suffer as a result of the Crusades, both sexual violence and being killed or taken into slavery. We can look at the displacement of indigenous communities. We can think about how the settlement process impacts on women and the settler societies that grow up around them. And we can also think about separation, so how the separation impacts on families. We can also look at those women who enable crusades and crusaders. So some of them acting as regents, some just giving financial support, but that was also very crucial, or raising funds to send out to the Holy Land when needed. There are those who offer spiritual support through prayer or other means. And the memorialization of the Crusades, remembering the Crusades in a variety of different ways, in family histories, in objects, in memory of those who die on Crusades as well. So if we look at the participation, one of the challenges we sometimes face is that individual motives are more difficult to ascertain if a woman is travelling with her male partner or a family member, and it's hard to tell the degree of agency they have in the decision to take the cross. I mean, we do see sometimes in crusade charters two people going on a journey to Jerusalem, and for the sake of their souls and the sake of their families. And that suggests a pious motivation. But otherwise, when it comes to kind of the written sources, people have tended to speculate much more about what male motivations might be rather than female motivations. And just as a case in point, if you teach the Second Crusade, very often there's a big section on, why did Louis VII take the cross? But we don't necessarily think about why Eleanor of Aquitaine might have wanted to take the cross. Why wasn't she left behind as a regent? Was it because she was too politically controversial? Did she need to go because she'd only had two children, but she'd only had one child at that point who was a daughter, and she still needed to provide a male heir? Was it necessary for her to go for that reason? Also, she was involved in the events that ended up with the burning of the church at Vitry, that was supposed to be a key motivation for Louis VII taking the cross. So I just think if we think about those things slightly differently, we can begin to build women into the picture a bit better. So we have to kind of balance with that. Is it about circumstances or is it about vocation for women? But I certainly do think we can find evidence of female piety as a motivation for crusade. And one of the key figures for that is Sybil of Anjou, or Flanders, as she is sometimes known. Now, she is a fantastic person. I've put here this. I mean, she's a fantastically interesting figure. She's essentially, her husband Thierry of Flanders is a serial crusader. He goes maybe 4 times out to the Holy Land. It may be the case that he really did ultimately want to settle out there and carve himself out a piece of territory and had ambitions to go there. But while he's doing that, and while he goes out the first couple of times, Sybil stays back in Flanders. She acts as a regent. In one instance, she's very heavily pregnant and has to sort of fight off an invading force, and ask for help for the Pope as well, kind of cash in on the protection that she's supposed to be offered. And then finally, when he goes out again, she gets to go with him. And while he goes and pursues his military activities, she stays in a convent and is attracted by the life there. And when he returns to Jerusalem, she says, actually, do you know what? I don't want to come back with you. I'm not going to go. I'm sorry, I'm going to stay here. And he's devastated, and he gets the king and the patriarch to come and talk to her and say, no, you've got to go home. And she says, no, I want to enter the convent and live my days out in Jerusalem. And in the end, she does, and becomes a nun in the convent of Bethany. On the right here, this is an ivory cross that supposedly belonged to Sybil. That's at the Met Museum. Sort of an object of her sort of devotion. And there's also a wonderful account in the Chronique d'Ernul, the French continuation of William of Tyre, that kind of describes how she decides to enter this convent. And she says, God willing, I would never go back to Flanders nor sail anywhere again. And she did not want to change her mind. So she goes to the abbess and asked her for a nun's habit, and the abbess gave one to her. And when they arrived to speak to her, they found that she had been professed, and they were filled with sorrow. And even though it's against the will of her husband, she says that she wants to stay there and do her penitence. And again, suggesting a genuine pious motive. Another big question, of course, is whether women fought. This image here, although it's not of crusading women, it's of Amazons, in fact, and Queen Penthesilea, who's this kind of classical heroine, female fighter. It is produced in Acre in the 13th century, so it suggests that there is, kind of an interest in the female warrior figure in 13th century Acre. But again, I think that when we think about women fighting, we need to kind of move away from just thinking about them actually fighting in armour on the battlefield. There are a couple of accounts where in fact, from an Islamic perspective, where a couple of women were found on the battlefield, recorded by Ahmad ad-Din, and he says that we did not know that they were women until we removed their armour. But this is, these kind of references are very, very rare. And in fact, it's more likely that the way women get involved in warfare and fighting is through sieges, because when you're besieging a town, that's where women and children and everyone else lives, of course. Excuse me. So it's on that kind of more, when the Crusader camp is attacked, people are fulfilling auxiliary roles in that camp, and therefore, they're vulnerable. And also, women can be seen as valuable commodities, as slaves. So there's all of those issues to consider as well when thinking about whether women fought. So although in the Western sources you get, accounts of some women fighting, but only in extreme circumstances, and if they do, it's like with the help of God. But they are genuinely, often by default involved in sieges. Some might have a role leading troops. If, for example, the widow of Margrave Leopold II of Austria, Ida, takes the cross after the death of her husband in honouring, to honour his vow. So she's nominally got a sort of feudal role, but in the end, actually, she's involved in the Battle of Heraclea in 1101, which the Crusader army is completely defeated, and she's taken off into captivity. We see them bringing water, helping to build ditches, guarding camps, holding markets, healing. Louis IX has a female physician who looks after him when he's ill on his crusade, carrying out laundry, lice picking. All of these are activities that women are said to be involved in on crusades. Certainly, they seem to carry on with normal family life, and especially if you're noble, you have a duty to provide heirs, and therefore we do see quite a few children being born on crusades. And in fact, Louis IX's wife, Margaret of Provence, has 3 children while she's on crusade. Although there does still seem to be, concern from the authorities about having too many women on crusade leading to problems. So, for example, we have Henry II of England's ordinances for what becomes the Third Crusade. He says that only washerwomen of good repute should go on the crusade. But in fact, Richard takes both his sister, Joanna of Sicily, and his new wife, Berengaria. How am I doing for time? I'm just conscious of time. Okay. I can't not talk about Margaret of Beverly, because she's a really fascinating character, and also I'm close to Hull in my heart, so I'm very familiar with Beverly Minster, there's an image of here. Margaret she's actually born in Jerusalem to her parents while they're on pilgrimage in the east, and then they return to their home in Beverly. Her brother, Thomas of Froidmont, enters the church and becomes a member of the circle of Thomas of Becket. And once he's grown up, I don't think that Margaret has married at any point. There's no mention of her marrying. We're told that she decides to visit the land of her birth, so she goes back to Jerusalem and ends up arriving there just at the time when Saladin besieges it, and she fights on the walls of the city, wearing a cooking pot on her head, we are told, and she gets wounded by shrapnel while she's carrying water to the men fighting on the walls. And when the city falls, she's taken into slavery, and she is bought out of slavery ultimately, and then captured again. She has some quite kind of religious experiences wandering around in the wilderness. She goes on pilgrimages to various different holy sites and eventually goes back to the West around 1192. She also visits Rome and Santiago, and finally ends up going to see her brother in the convent, and he doesn't recognize her because it's been so long, and she has to tell him the names of their parents. I mean, it's a fabulous story, and it's written by her brother after she dies to kind of to tell the convent of nuns that she ultimately enters about her life, and it is quite a religious text, so it can't quite be taken verbatim as truth, but it's a really brilliant read and an interesting example of how a woman's life might be really affected by the Crusades. But should we call her a crusader, or is she just a pilgrim? This is one of the questions. We must also consider, how many references there are to women as victims of violence as a result of crusading activity. These were extremely bloody wars. People were captured and killed or taken off into slavery. very often we don't have names of people, we just have kind of a sort of token number of people who are mentioned, or even we just get statements like all the men were killed and all the women were taken captive. So it's very hard to kind of pinpoint specific examples. That said, you know, there are some examples in the Islamic literature of female slaves that have been taken sort of from Christian slaves who are, you know, have important functions in the household. And we are beginning to know more about how the slavery network worked across the Mediterranean during this period, which is really helping to understand what somebody's life might have been like. And I think, again, that's another way of exploring this issue. In terms of settlement, of course, we do see, especially at the top level, Crusaders marrying into indigenous families, but mostly Christian families. So Armenians, Byzantines, potentially some Syrian Christians, but those tend to be, the high profile marriages tend to be more sort of Armenians and Byzantines. So the royal wives, we have Ada, who marries Baldwin, although that marriage doesn't work out terribly well. Then we have Morphia, who marries Baldwin II. And then the Byzantine wives, Theodora and Maria Komnena, who marry Baldwin III and Amalric, respectively. And they're all like useful ways of exploring the impact of crusading on women's lives. I think as well as that, there's some interesting work being done about this kind of the way that such women are written about in history as kind of auxiliaries of conquest, by Kim Phillips. She's been doing some very interesting work on that at the moment. And then we have, of course, you know, again, these concerns about interreligious relationships. So in 1120 at the Council of Nablus, the church wants to step in and regulate sexual behaviour between Christians and Muslims to make sure that that is not going on. But the fact they have to legislate suggests that it probably is. We also have, you know, this idea of settler women providing political stability and continuity as the Crusaders come out and fight. Many of them end up dying. You know, a new wave comes over and marries into the existing noble structure. So again, have they got a particular role in providing continuity there? But this is not just, and I should note, this is not just in terms of having children. This is in terms of running administrative lordships and having kind of serious political clout in the region. We also should think about Islamic and Turkish women. Sometimes it is harder to, because the perspective is somewhat different, and because there was so much going on in this region, very often women's lives are affected by so many different factors. You know, we have this conflict going on between the Seljuks and the Fatimids throughout the early kind of Crusader settlement period, which is one of the reasons why the Crusaders are able to settle. You know, we've got conflict going on between established Arab groups, between the Seljuks, between the Fatimids, and obviously religious split as well. So in that respect, you know, a lot of the Islamic source material is much more focused on those, you know, the wider picture and all of the different aspects. Crusading is just kind of, you know, an aside in some respects to some of those things. Although, you know, some of the very serious, for example, the capture of Jerusalem was seen as a very significant event. But in terms of some key figures that could be fruitfully discussed in class would be somebody like perhaps Zumurrud of Damascus. So she's born around 1095, 1100, so a contemporary of Melisande, Queen Melisande of Jerusalem, and Alice of Antioch. She is the half sister of Dukak of Damascus, who's a very significant and powerful ruler in Syria, but she's widowed in 1132, after her husband Bury was attacked by assassins. And again, it kind of shows how the infighting is really affecting people's lives. It seems like many of these women had a big role as patrons, and building, architecture in particular is one way of showing your status and power. So she builds the Madrasa Khatuniya Extramuros in Damascus. And so she's clearly got some significant backing. Interestingly, she also is such an influential political figure that the nobles trust her and actually go to her for help against her own son, Ismail, who is not a very good ruler. He's not very popular, but also she has been potentially accused of a relationship with someone that she should not be having a relationship with, and is concerned that her son might turn against her and try and kill her as well. So she arranges his assassination. And the story is given in Ibn al-Athir. She tells how, this is done in a very public place so that everybody knows that, that this guy has been got rid of. In the end, in fact, she marries Zengi and asks him to avenge the death of another son. So she is kind of connected to the Crusades. Zengi, of course, is the guy who then captures Edessa in 1144, which kicks off the Second Crusade. And I think, if we consider her story in comparison to somebody like Queen Melisande, you really get a fantastic idea of how many powerful women there are in this region at the time. Another one we could look at is Queen Arwa of Yemen. Now, she seems like an absolutely fantastic figure. She's a bit older, born around 1047 to 8, but she lasts a good 90 years. So actually, she might be a good comparison with Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, who also has a similar longevity. She rules on behalf of a sick regent, a sick husband, and then is regent for her sons, and then another husband until they all die. And then ultimately she kind of rules pretty much on her own for the next 40 odd years. How does she manage to get away? I mean, this is quite an unusual situation in the Islamic world. She does seem to have a lot of support from the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, and they give her kind of extra special status. But she does also take some of that on board herself. She deliberately has her name read out in the khutbah, which is the sermon that is given regularly, which is usually like just for the sovereigns. So her and her husband's name initially are read out, and then just her. And then she's also given this special title, Huja, by the Caliph. And this implies that she has a very special relationship with God. So again, she's got sort of religious as well as secular authority, which is just fascinating. As a woman, she does have a series of military commanders who she deputizes for, and that's the same with Melisande. She has the Constable of Jerusalem to run her army, but she does, when necessary, also kind of march out and negotiate with her own army when one of her commanders dies. We can also think about, back in the West, women as enablers of the Crusade movement in different ways. So organising finance, giving property and money, not just to the Crusades actually, but to the military orders, who are becoming hugely influential in the 12th and 13th century. By the time we get to the 13th century, Innocent III changes some things for women. He basically says, you can pay money or pay a crusader to go for you, and you will still get the same spiritual benefits. So you can sit, it's like armchair crusading. You sit at home and you still get all the benefits. However, that said, it does seem like there were still women who wanted to go on crusade, and there's a passenger list of a crusader ship in the 1250s, which shows that there are women travelling both with husbands and on their own to go out to the east. We also have holy women like Hildegard of Bingen there, writing to Crusaders like Philip of Flanders, telling them how they could make their crusade a spiritual success. In terms of regents, Adela Bois is a very good example that you could bring into a classroom. She is the daughter of William the Conqueror, one of the daughters of William the Conqueror. She's married to Stephen, who is the one who runs away from the siege of Antioch in 1098. She's so horrified by this, according to Orderic Vitalis, that she sends him back with a flea in his ear, and then he actually dies on the 1101 crusade. But we do have, quite a lot of resources. There's Kimberly Lopret is the person who's done the most work on Adela, I think. But we have a huge number of letters and resources for her time of regency, and a lot of circumstantial evidence that link her to the Crusades, like the fact that she's linked to one of the first Crusade chroniclers, that she helps promote Beaumont's Crusade drive in France. So she's seen as somebody who is clearly pro-Crusade, even though she never takes the journey herself. And then finally, thinking about remembering the Crusades, obviously in the West, people are remembering their family members who have died. Countess Ella of Salisbury, for example, is commissioning things after the death of William Longspay. But we have as well, somebody like Anna Komnena, who is a Byzantine woman who is incredibly well educated and a Byzantine princess, but who, when writing the history of her father, she talks a lot about the Crusade and her experiences of the Crusade as it came through. So we do have that kind of first person account as well. Finally then, how does this help? I'll bring things to a close because I'm conscious that we're getting up to time. I think what we can do is that there are some good points and bad points about doing this kind of history. What we've got to be careful of is not kind of doing your traditional women's history approach to women and crusading, because clearly we don't want to treat those women on crusades as some kind of pioneers or that they're doing a good thing. They're not doing a good thing, they're on crusade. So the thing that we need to think about is, why are they involved? How do they get involved? Are they choosing to do this? Are they being coerced into doing it? Are they doing it for their families? And then we also need to think about the people who are impacted, not just the people who are doing. We need to think about the responsibilities of people who are allowing this kind of activity to flourish in their societies. And we need to explore, take the opportunity where we can to explore diverse comparisons. They're there, we can use them. And I think we should also take a less Eurocentric focus to the Crusades. If we stop looking at the elite few at the top of the crusading army, we can begin to get a much wider picture of how much this has impacted on history more broadly. Okay, there's a little summary there. And I'll just put that up, and then I guess people can pause on it on the YouTube if they want to. And again, a little select general bibliography there of some useful resources. And then that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Genuinely, thanks so much. That was incredibly interesting. And I'm sure I speak for everybody, really, when I say that. Please do, those of you who are still on the call, put any questions that you've got for Natasha into the Q&A for us. That'd be grand. But I do actually, if you indulge me, have a couple myself. So first of all, I hope this isn't cheeky, but and slash isn't too niche, But you were speaking kind of early on about this kind of issue around sin, and every time that there is some sort of dramatic loss in battle, that it's usually attributed to some sort of sin occurring. You might not have researched this / researched it yet, but how do they reconcile something like the Fourth Crusade and the stories that come out of what was happening in the Hagia Sophia, for example, on the high altar, and
well, Innocent III was really annoyed, and in his first response to this, he was like, "What did you do?" But then he kind of rationalized it with himself that, well, God must have wanted this to happen, therefore, it's okay. And it has ultimately, because the papacy, well, for the Fourth Crusade, the papacy has always wanted to bring the Byzantine Church back into the fold. And essentially for Innocent, okay, he's not happy about the way it happens, but he's very happy that it happens. And now, it's made his job harder in terms of, securing that hold. And in the end, it doesn't really work out. But he kind of rationalizes it in that way, that God must have wanted this to happen. I mean, there's some really interesting, because of course they bring so many relics back from the Fourth Crusade as well. And there's this really interesting idea that was put forward in Patrick Geary's book, Furta Sacra, I don't know if it was Sacred Theft book, which basically says, if you can get away with stealing a relic, the saint must have wanted to come with you. And therefore, this kind of justifies, you can actually get away with this. There's a great story, there's a great Fourth Crusade text about this guy Abbot Martin of Paris, who goes and basically, it's what we would call a narratio. It's a story about how you get away with stealing relics. But yeah. So another very interesting, because I do quite a bit of stuff on masculinity and crusading as well, and that's always really interesting, because it's not just knights on crusade. There's these big important clerics and bishops who aren't supposed to be, but how do they get the respect of all the fighting crusading men? So there's a lot of dynamics going on there.
That's really interesting. As a relatively recently reluctantly retired rugby player, I'm sure there are some similarities in a rugby change room as well. That's a story for another day. Harriet, I don't think anything's coming in Q&A yet, has it?
Not at the moment. We've got people saying thank you. It was a very interesting talk.
I did have a couple of other questions, if that's all right, if you'll indulge me, Harriet. I don't know if you've got any as well. So kind of sources wise, it strikes me that obviously it's sometimes somewhat more problematic trying to research and study women's history. I mean, the obvious thing that I thought about is I've recently been reading this book, which I've got a blurred screen on, so I don't know if you can see it, which is fantastic. If people haven't read it, if you teach migrants or migration through time, thematically use this book. I always say a name wrong. I think it's Laodicea, possibly Laodicea, of Winchester. It's wicked. But kind of what might your advice be to history teachers who are trying to teach more medieval women's history? What's the best way for us to engage with that? Is it for us to talk to academics like you, read your books? Can we access things ourselves? What's the best way for us to engage in that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's loads of fabulous resources out there, I think. So I guess it's a question of us academics helping to point the way to those resources. And I am fully understanding of the fact that the majority of teachers are working incredibly hard and long hours, and trying to find new resources to put stuff in is really difficult. So making those resources as easy to find as possible is really good. I'm hoping to be working with the Historical Association to do some potted biographies of women and crusades, at least for this, but perhaps more broadly for medieval women as well, which would be good. But I know that Historical Association is also, not everybody's a member of that, so finding ways to direct people to simply yeah, even lesson plans and those kind of things, that would be really, really good. I'm really keen to kind of get involved in all of that. The other thing I would say is that it's not just about what teachers are doing, it's about what the exam boards are doing and about the curriculum. And I'm fully aware that, you know, that teachers want their kids to do as well as they possibly can in their assessments. And if the assessments don't include women, then they fall by the wayside. So it's got to be absolutely in all of those assessments, and it's got to be on the exam board curriculums, and it's got to be in all of those places in order for that to work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think is a question from Roxanne that's coming in the chat. Harriet, I don't know if you wanted to read that one out.
I think it's just a comment.
It's a comment.
Yeah, it's just about a pilgrimage could be used as
a punishment. Would women be sent for punishment of crimes or sins? That's really interesting, actually. I mean, definitely we do get some men going on crusade because of crimes that they've committed, and you know, they get sent off. It's harder to find with women, but there are some examples. There's an example of a woman who so that if we look at some of the court records, occasionally you do see information about women who are involved in some kind of litigious activity, either before or after going on crusade. And there's one that I can think of who basically she's accused someone of rape, but the claim of rape doesn't go through because she's in Jerusalem. And that's all we hear. So is it because she feels, you know, that she has a sin to expiate that's made her take the cross and go to Jerusalem? Was it because the actual rape itself made her life so untenable in the area that she just thought, well, I'll just go? I mean, you know, we don't get any of that information. We just get the little snippet in the court record, and that's it.
Do we know if she came back even? I suppose there's no.
The case was basically thrown out because she wasn't there to pursue it. And that's all we know.
That's really interesting. The only other question I had, and apologies for hogging it, but if you were teaching, so I'm teaching Crusades A-level next year.
Yeah.
If you with OCR, but kind of putting into your own context, if you were teaching, say, an introductory undergrad course at university on the Crusades, generally, how would you kind of approach weaving women into that? Would it be a kind of explicit approach, you know, taking women as a theme through Crusades? Would it be more an implicit approach, kind of blending and weaving them throughout? Would it be a mixture of the two? How would you envisage something like that working?
Right, well, I mean, I've tested this out in a variety of different ways. I have to say that I mean, I tend to avoid now trying to have this is the session on women and the Crusades, because and usually everybody does the essay on that, which is great, but they also, I think part of the reason they do it, they think it's easy. but so I tend to try and weave it in throughout each subject, each week, each topic, to have something on women, and whether that's women in general or whether it's, you know, specific individuals who are mentioned and explained, then that's what I try to do. And I also try to get people thinking about gender, because so much of crusading is bound up in masculinity as well. It's all about how to be a good manly Christian man, and you know, this hyper masculinity is like, this is the ultimate thing you can do if you want to prove your Christian manhood. So I think if you're talking about gender as well, that can kind of help, because that gets people thinking about, oh, well, okay, yeah, I can see now why women, you know, you don't naturally think about women when doing this stuff, but actually we could, and we could, you know, bring them in a lot more by focusing not just on the people who go, although, you know, there are, and they are there, and there's plenty to talk about, but thinking about casting the net really wide.
Yeah, the women that don't go, or equally the men that don't go. That's really interesting, and I suppose comes back to what you're saying before about our need to influence exam boards, doesn't it? And actually, if that was part of the spec, and there were potentially questions on the nature of gender, that would be really interesting, especially at A-level, where I think we could explore that really well.
I mean, it is this thing of, and also I'm conscious as well, though, that, some people teach Crusades at Key Stage 3, and usually in Year 7. So it's like, how do you kind of do that without going down the route? Because not many people are going to do the Crusades A level. Most people, when they leave school, might have had a little brief understanding of it from this one bit in Year 7. So if we can start there, and start sort of shoehorning in a different perspective. I'm really interested in knowing more about how people are teaching it at Key Stage 3. So if anybody is out there and wants to talk to me about it, I'd be very interested to hear how you approach it, and if there's anything I could do to help.
That's great. And I mean, I think actually, like, a lot of what you've spoken about that I wasn't aware of, I'm ashamed to know I didn't know about Margaret Beverly running around the walls when the cooking pot on her head. I know I'll absolutely be using that in Year 7. I know I will absolutely be using that with Year 12 next year. What a wonderful story. So yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's the stories that we can share, that we can weave in a kind of non-tokenistic way, both Year 7 or Year 12 or Year 13. Brilliant. I don't think there's any more questions that have come in, Harriet, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, just some more thanks, and someone saying, yes please, the HA potted summaries sound great and so on. That's led them to think about Chaucer's female pilgrims, about what he's telling about social norms of the day, and thank you again.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, women are out there, they're travelling, they are kind of getting out and about and doing stuff. And a really nice parallel with Margaret Beverly actually is Marjorie Kemp, because they go to all the same places, and
yeah, that'd be really interesting. So I'm just writing that down. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I've learned so much, and it's been incredibly useful, an absolute tour de force. So thank you so much. And I clearly, from everything that's coming in the chat, echo the thoughts of everybody who's joined us tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
My pleasure. Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care, Natasha.
Bye.